Everyone at Forward Operating Base Viper knew Emma Torres as the quiet nurse who never made waves. Small, soft-spoken, always ready with a gentle smile and a steady hand during medical emergencies. What they didn't know was that this unassuming woman would soon pilot a Blackhawk helicopter through a hailstorm of enemy fire to save 12 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines, revealing a past so extraordinary it would shake the entire base to its core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Syrian desert in August was unforgiving. Temperatures that could melt steel, sandstorms that lasted for days, and heat that made every breath feel like swallowing fire. Most personnel at Forward Operating Base Viper complained endlessly about the conditions, but Emma Torres just adjusted her hijab, checked her medical supplies, and kept working. At 31, Emma looked more like a librarian than a military nurse, standing barely 5'3" in her combat boots, with gentle brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down her nose during the heat. Her dark hair was always neatly tucked under her hijab, and everything about her demeanor screamed handle with care, which was exactly how everyone treated her. "Morning, Emma," Dr. Kim would call out as she organized medical supplies before the sunrise shift. "You sure you don't need help lifting those supply crates? They look heavy for someone your size." She'd just smile, adjust her glasses, and continue her work. Never complained, never asked for lighter duties. While other nurses rotated through different departments, Emma volunteered for the trauma ward, the most demanding and dangerous assignment on base. While others gathered in the recreation tent during downtime, she spent her free time maintaining medical equipment that wasn't even her responsibility. The senior medical staff found her endearing. "Sweet little thing," they'd whisper. Probably never raised her voice in her life. They were protective of her in that well-meaning but patronizing way that made Emma's jaw tighten, though she never let it show. Dr. Kim, the head of medical operations, treated her like a daughter, always checking if she was eating enough, sleeping enough, handling the stress well enough. Lieutenant Cross, the medical officer, would assign her the easier patients, assuming she couldn't handle the more severe trauma cases. What they didn't see were the technical manuals she kept hidden in her footlocker. Pages and pages of helicopter maintenance diagrams, rotor mechanics, flight navigation charts drawn with the precision of an aerospace engineer. Late at night in her bunk, she'd study satellite imagery of the surrounding terrain, memorizing landing zones and calculating fuel consumption rates by the light of a small flashlight. Her bunkmate, Specialist Taylor, had once asked about the papers scattered on Emma's bed. "Just helps me understand the medical evacuations better," Emma had said quietly, quickly gathering the documents. "Knowing how the helicopters work helps me prepare patients for transport." Taylor had accepted this explanation, never suspecting that Emma could identify every bolt, every wire, every system in those aircraft better than most of the pilots who flew them. One scorching afternoon, the base's communication array malfunctioned. The radar guidance system had suffered a power surge, and the tech crew was baffled by the complex wiring. Emma happened to be walking past the communications bunker when she heard Sergeant Foster and his team arguing about the problem. "Excuse me," she said softly, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Mind if I take a look?" Foster laughed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Emma, honey, this is advanced electronics. You'll get electrocuted." But she was already kneeling by the open panel, her small hands tracing the circuitry with surgical precision. Within 15 minutes, she'd identified a blown capacitor and rerouted the power flow through a backup system. The radar hummed back to life, displaying clear images of the surrounding desert. Foster stared in amazement. "How the hell did you know how to do that?" "I used to study this kind of thing," Emma said simply, wiping her hands on her uniform, "before I became a nurse." But she didn't elaborate, and nobody pressed for details. They just assumed she'd taken some basic electronics courses, maybe dabbled in technical work before settling into healthcare. The truth was buried somewhere in her personnel file. Nobody had bothered to read thoroughly in 3 years. Base Commander Captain Blake walked past her table in the mess tent one evening. Emma was sitting alone as usual, sketching what looked like flight patterns on a napkin while picking at her dinner. The drawings were incredibly detailed altitude calculations, wind resistance factors, approach angles that seemed far too sophisticated for casual interest. "Interesting hobby," Blake commented, glancing at her sketches. "Just helps me think, sir," Emma replied quickly, folding the napkin. What she didn't tell him was that every line, every angle, every calculation was textbook perfect. The kind of precision that would make flight instructors weep with pride. The kind of knowledge that only came from hundreds of hours in actual cockpits, not from reading manuals at night. When the base grew quiet and most personnel were asleep, Emma would walk to the flight line. She'd stand next to the UH-60 Blackhawks, running her hands along the fuselage like she was greeting old friends. The night mechanics thought it was endearing, the little nurse with her helicopter fascination. They had no idea she knew every system, every vulnerability, every capability of those machines better than they did. Sometimes she'd catch herself unconsciously checking fuel levels, inspecting rotor assemblies, noting maintenance issues that the crew had missed. Her supervisor, Dr. Kim, asked her once during the quiet moment in the medical bay, "Emma, you never talk about your life before. The military. Where did you grow up? What made you want to become a nurse?" Emma adjusted her glasses and continued organizing medical supplies. "Some things are better left in the past, doctor. But the past shapes who we are, doesn't it?" "Yes," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "But sometimes who we were doesn't matter as much as who we need to be right now." Because buried in that personnel file, beneath layers of classified stamps and redacted information, was a different story entirely. A story of a pilot so skilled, so fearless, that her dismissal from active flight duty looked less like standard procedure and more like bureaucratic punishment. A story of someone who had flown rescue missions that other pilots deemed impossible, who had saved lives in conditions that defied every safety protocol, who had been quietly reassigned to medical duties after refusing to abandon civilians in a war zone. The other nurses saw Emma as sweet, gentle, perhaps a little fragile. They didn't see the steel in her spine, the calm that came from having faced death at 10,000 feet, the steady hands that had controlled aircraft through enemy fire, while rockets exploded around her. They saw someone who needed protection, not someone who had spent years being the protection others needed. Dr. Kim would often assign Emma to the safer shifts, the routine checkups, the minor injuries. "No need to overwhelm yourself with the trauma cases," she'd say kindly. "Let the more experienced nurses handle the serious stuff." Emma never argued, never pushed back. She just smiled, adjusted her glasses, and did whatever was asked of her. But late at night, when the emergency alarm sounded and all hands were needed, Emma would transform. Her movements became precise, efficient, almost mechanical in their perfection. She could stabilize a patient faster than nurses with twice her experience, could predict complications before they manifested, could work in chaos as if it were complete silence. "She's got good instincts," the other nurses would say. "Natural talent for staying calm under pressure." They had no idea that Emma's calmness came from having been under pressure that made medical emergencies seem like routine maintenance. No idea that her steady hands had once guided multi-million-dollar aircraft through combat zones, where one wrong move meant death for everyone on board. The truth was, Emma Torres wasn't just a nurse who happened to know about helicopters. She was a pilot who had learned to heal because she'd seen too much death, who had traded her wings for a stethoscope because someone had decided her conscience made her unfit to fly. She was someone who had been forced to choose between following orders and saving lives, and had chosen to save lives every single time. But that choice had cost her everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of being. Until the day when 12 soldiers would need someone willing to make that choice again, and Emma would prove that some people don't need permission to be heroes. They just need the chance. The desert heat continued to beat down on forward operating Base Viper, but change was coming. The kind of change that arrives suddenly, violently, and reveals exactly who people really are when everything is on the line. For Emma Torres, that revelation was just hours away. The signs were always there, subtle as shadows in the Syrian desert, but nobody was looking closely enough to see them. Emma Torres had spent 3 years perfecting the art of hiding in plain sight, and she was very, very good at it. It started with the little things. During medical helicopter evacuations, when pilots complained about crosswinds or challenging landing conditions, Emma would quietly mention wind patterns that most ground personnel wouldn't understand. The thermal updrafts shift around 1400 hours, she'd say softly while preparing a patient for transport. Might want to adjust your approach angle by 5 degrees. The pilots would look at her strangely, then radio the flight tower to confirm wind conditions. They were always exactly as she'd predicted. Dr. Kim noticed it first during a particularly difficult evacuation. The Blackhawk pilot was struggling with dust interference, unable to get a clear visual for landing. Emma watched through the medical bay window, her jaw tightening with each failed approach. "He's coming in too steep," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "In these conditions, he needs to use the collective more gradually, compensate for the downdraft." "What did you say?" Dr. Kim asked, turning from her patient charts. "Nothing, doctor, just hoping they land safely." But Emma's hands were clenched into fists, and her eyes tracked the helicopter with the precision of someone who understood exactly what the pilot was doing wrong. When the Blackhawk finally touched down safely after 6 attempts, Emma released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The maintenance crews began to notice her too. During her evening walks to the flight line, Emma would pause by aircraft that were scheduled for routine maintenance. The next morning, mechanics would discover exactly the issues she'd unconsciously noted the night before. A loose bolt here, a worn gasket there, hydraulic pressure readings that were slightly off normal parameters. "Strangest thing, Chief Mechanic," Rodriguez told Sergeant Foster one afternoon. "That little nurse seems to have a sixth sense about these birds. Yesterday she mentioned hearing an unusual sound from Blackhawk 7. Turned out the tail rotor needed adjustment." "How does a nurse know what a tail rotor should sound like?" Foster shrugged. "Maybe she's just observant. Some people notice details others miss." What he didn't say was that he'd been watching Emma during her nighttime visits to the flight line. The way she moved around the aircraft wasn't random curiosity. It was systematic, professional. She checked fuel connections, examined rotor assemblies, noted instrument readings through cockpit windows. It was the behavior of someone who'd been trained to conduct pre-flight inspections, not someone with a casual interest in aviation. The pattern became more obvious during briefings. When flight operations discussed mission parameters, Emma would attend as medical support, supposedly there to understand patient transport requirements. But Captain Blake noticed that her questions were unusually sophisticated. "What's the ceiling for cloud cover in Sector 7? She'd ask. "Have we accounted for atmospheric pressure changes at that altitude?" These weren't the questions of someone concerned only with medical logistics. Private Morgan, the communications specialist, started bringing Emma technical problems that had nothing to do with medical equipment. A malfunctioning radio frequency modulator, a damaged GPS navigation unit, satellite communication arrays that were receiving interference. Emma would examine these devices with the focused intensity of a surgeon, her hands moving with practiced confidence through circuits and components that should have been completely foreign to a nurse. She fixed our backup navigation system in 20 minutes, Morgan told Lieutenant Cross. The same system that had our electronics team stumped for 3 days. When I asked where she learned about satellite communications, she just said she'd picked up some things over the years. But it was during the sandstorm incident that Emma's expertise became impossible to ignore. A massive dust storm had engulfed the base, grounding all aircraft and cutting off most electronic communications. The meteorological equipment was malfunctioning, unable to provide accurate readings for wind speed and visibility. Flight operations were flying blind, with no way to predict when conditions would improve enough for emergency evacuations. Emma found Captain Blake in the command center, staring helplessly at weather displays that showed nothing but static interference. "Captain," she said quietly, "I might be able to help with the weather prediction." Blake looked up, exhaustion evident in his eyes. "Emma, I appreciate the offer, but this requires specialized meteorological training." "I understand, sir. But I've studied atmospheric conditions extensively. I could manually calculate wind patterns using barometric pressure readings and thermal differential data." Blake stared at her. These weren't terms a nurse should know, let alone be able to apply practically. "Where exactly did you study atmospheric conditions, Torres?" Emma hesitated, realizing she'd revealed too much. I took some courses before joining the medical corps, sir. Thought it might help with understanding helicopter transport conditions." It was a weak explanation, and they both knew it. But within an hour, Emma had provided weather predictions that proved startlingly accurate. She calculated wind speed, changes predicted thermal patterns, and estimated visibility improvements down to 15-minute intervals. "The storm will clear from the northeast sector first," she told Blake, drawing wind pattern diagrams that looked like they'd come from a meteorological textbook. "Visibility should improve to acceptable flight levels in approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. She was correct within 5 minutes. Dr. Kim cornered Emma later that evening. "I've been thinking about your background," she said, settling into a chair across from Emma's desk. "Your medical skills are exceptional, but some of your knowledge seems unusual for someone with only nursing training." Emma kept her eyes focused on her patient charts. "I've always been curious about how things work, doctor. I read a lot in my spare time. Reading doesn't explain how you knew exactly which circuits to bypass when our blood analyzer malfunctioned, or how you predicted that helicopter engine failure 3 weeks ago, or how you seem to understand weather patterns better than our meteorological specialists." Dr. Kim's voice was gentle but persistent. "Emma, I'm not trying to pry into your personal life. But if you have additional training or experience that could help our operations, perhaps you should consider sharing it." "I'm just a nurse, doctor," Emma said softly. "That's all I've ever wanted to be." But Dr. Kim had seen the way Emma's hands moved over technical equipment, the confidence in her voice when she discussed complex systems, the almost unconscious way she conducted what looked like pre-flight inspections during her evening walks. These weren't the behaviors of someone who'd simply read a lot about aviation. That night, Dr. Kim requested Emma's complete personnel file from military records. What she found was mostly standard information: nursing school graduation, medical, corps training, exemplary service record. But there were gaps. Periods of time that weren't fully accounted for. Training programs listed without specific details, and most strangely, a section of her file that was classified at a level far above what a nurse should require. Why would a nurse's file have classified sections? Dr. Kim wondered aloud, staring at her computer screen. What kind of nursing training requires that level of security clearance? Meanwhile, Emma lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant hum of generators. She'd been careful for 3 years, hiding her past, suppressing the instincts that came from hundreds of hours in cockpits. But the cracks were showing. People were asking questions, noticing patterns, putting together pieces of a puzzle she'd tried so hard to scatter in her footlocker. Beneath her medical textbooks and nursing supplies lay a small photograph. Emma, in flight gear, standing next to a Blackhawk helicopter, her face younger, but her eyes holding the same quiet intensity. Behind her, a sign read Advanced Combat Aviation Training, Class of 2019. In the photo, she wasn't wearing a nurse's uniform. She was wearing pilot's wings. The photograph was the last tangible piece of a life she'd been forced to leave behind. A life where she'd been known not as the quiet nurse who fixed things, but as Lieutenant Emma Torres, one of the most gifted helicopter pilots the military had ever trained. A pilot whose career had ended not because she lacked skill, but because she'd possessed too much conscience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for her carefully constructed facade to slip. But tonight, Emma Torres held on to the secret that defined her. She wasn't a nurse who happened to understand helicopters. She was a pilot who'd learned to heal because she'd been forbidden to fly. The desert wind continued to howl outside, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. August 15th, 0545 hours. The emergency alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence like a gunshot through glass. Emma jolted awake in her bunk, instantly alert while around her, other personnel groaned and fumbled for their gear. But this wasn't the usual medical emergency alarm. This was the Combat Alert 3 sharp blasts, followed by a continuous wail that meant soldiers were in immediate danger. Emma pulled on her boots and ran across the compound, her breath creating small clouds in the surprisingly cool desert morning. The operations center was already buzzing with frantic activity. Radio chatter filled the air, officers shouted coordinates, and the main tactical display showed red emergency markers scattered across a sector map that made Emma's blood run cold. "What's the situation?" she asked Private Morgan, who was frantically adjusting radio frequencies. Morgan looked up, his face pale with stress. "Bad one, Torres. Real bad. Patrol unit got ambushed in the Caraba Valley, about 60 clicks northeast of here. 12 soldiers pinned down by heavy enemy fire. They're trapped in a narrow canyon with no ground evacuation route." Emma's heart sank as she studied the tactical display. The Caraba Valley was notorious among military personnel, a maze of steep cliffs and narrow passages that created perfect ambush conditions. Local insurgent groups used it as a stronghold because it was nearly impossible to assault and equally difficult to escape from. "Where are our helicopters?" Emma asked, though she already suspected the answer. "That's the problem," Captain Blake said grimly, approaching with a radio in his hand. "Our primary flight crew is conducting training exercises at Al-Tanf 200 kilometers south. They won't be back for 6 hours minimum. Our backup pilots are escorting a medical evacuation convoy that got delayed by an IED explosion. Earliest they can return is 8 hours. Emma felt her stomach drop. In the Caraba Valley, under heavy enemy fire, 8 hours might as well be 8 days. She'd studied that terrain extensively during her late-night map sessions. The canyon walls created a natural funnel that trapped anyone inside, while the elevated positions gave attackers every advantage. Without immediate air support, those 12 soldiers were sitting ducks. "What about civilian aviation support?" Dr. Kim asked, having arrived to assess medical requirements for the eventual evacuation. Lieutenant Cross shook his head. The Syrian government grounded all civilian aircraft in this sector after yesterday's rocket attacks. International Aviation Authority won't authorize civilian flights into active combat zones. Captain Blake was already on the radio with higher command, his voice tense with frustration. Viper Base to Regional Command, requesting immediate air support for trapped patrol unit. 12 souls in hostile territory, heavy enemy fire, no ground evacuation possible. The response came back filled with static but clear enough. Viper Base, no air assets available for immediate deployment. Maintain defensive positions and await backup. ETA for air support is 6 to 8 hours. Sir, Blake responded, the patrol unit doesn't have 6 to 8 hours. They're running low on ammunition and have 3 wounded soldiers requiring immediate medical attention. Understood, Viper Base. Continue monitoring situation. Regional command out. Emma listened to this exchange with growing urgency. She knew the Karaba Valley better than most people on the base realized. She'd studied its approach vectors, calculated landing zones, analyzed the tactical challenges it presented. More importantly, she knew exactly what kind of flying would be required to extract soldiers from that terrain under enemy fire. The kind of flying that required precision, experience, and nerves of steel. The kind of flying she'd once specialized in. Private Morgan updated the tactical display with new information from the trapped patrol. They're reporting increased enemy activity, at least 30 hostiles in elevated positions. RPG fire confirmed. They've got maybe 2 hours of ammunition left. Dr. Kim began organizing medical supplies for the eventual evacuation, but Emma could see the resignation in her movements. Everyone knew that in 2 hours, there might not be anyone left to evacuate. Captain, Emma said quietly, stepping closer to Blake, I might have a solution. Blake looked at her with tired eyes. Torres, unless you've got a helicopter hidden somewhere, I don't see how. I can fly the Blackhawk in Hangar 2. The operations center went completely silent. Every conversation stopped. Every radio check paused. Every person turned to stare at the small nurse who just claimed she could pilot a military helicopter into a combat zone. Blake blinked several times, as if he hadn't heard correctly. I'm sorry, what did you just say? The UH-60 in Hangar 2 is fueled and ready for operation. I can fly it to the Karaba Valley and extract the patrol unit. Emma's voice was calm, professional, but her hands were trembling slightly. Lieutenant. Cross laughed, but it was a nervous sound with no humor in it. Torres, you're a nurse. You don't have any flight training, let alone combat aviation experience. Yes, I do, Emma said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Captain Blake studied her face, looking for signs of stress-induced delusion or psychological breakdown. Emma, I know you're upset about the situation, but flying a helicopter isn't something you can learn from books or, I'm a certified military helicopter pilot. Emma interrupted, her voice stronger now. Advanced Combat Aviation Training, Class of 2019, 2 tours in Afghanistan, over 300 combat flight hours, specialized in hostile territory extraction. Blake stared at her as if she'd just announced she was from another planet. That's impossible. Your file says you're a nurse. You've been here 3 years as medical personnel. My file has classified sections that you don't have clearance to access, Emma replied. But 12 soldiers are going to die if we don't act now, and I'm the only pilot currently available on this base. Morgan was frantically typing on his computer terminal. Captain, I'm pulling up her service record. There are definitely classified sections here. High-level classifications that require special authorization to access. Dr. Kim stepped forward, her face pale with realization. Emma, is this why you know so much about helicopter systems? Why you can fix navigation equipment and predict weather patterns? Yes, Doctor. I wasn't reading about these things for curiosity. I was maintaining skills I hoped I'd never have to use again. Captain Blake grabbed his radio. Regional Command, Viper Base, requesting immediate authorization to access classified personnel files for Nurse Emma Torres. We have a potential solution to the Karaba Valley situation. The response was immediate and sharp. Viper Base, clarify your request. What kind of solution involves a nurse's personnel file? Blake looked at Emma, then back at his radio. Sir, Nurse Torres claims to be a certified military helicopter pilot with combat experience. She's volunteering to conduct the extraction mission. A long pause filled with static. Then, Viper Base, stand by for verification. While they waited, Emma walked to the tactical display and began studying the terrain maps with the focused intensity of someone planning a military operation. Her finger traced potential approach routes, identified landing zones, calculated fuel requirements and flight times. "The canyon has 3 possible extraction points," she said, addressing the room like a briefing officer. LZ Alpha is closest to the patrol's position, but completely exposed to enemy fire. LZ Bravo offers better cover, but requires the patrol to move 200 meters under fire. LZ Charlie is the safest approach but means a longer exposure time. For the aircraft. Sergeant Foster, who'd been quietly observing, stepped closer to the display. "How do you know about these landing zones?" "They're not marked on any standard map." Emma pointed to elevation markers and terrain features. "You can calculate potential helicopter landing sites by analyzing slope angles, ground composition, and clearance requirements. This valley has been used for tactical operations before. There are only so many places a Blackhawk can safely touch down." The radio crackled to life. "Viper Base. This is Regional Command. Classification verification complete." Lieutenant Emma Torres was indeed an active helicopter pilot until 2021, reassigned to medical duties. Following a disciplinary action, she is technically qualified to pilot UH-60 aircraft. Blake felt the world tilt around him. "Lieutenant? You're not just a nurse, you're an officer?" "Former officer," Emma corrected. "I was demoted to enlisted status and reassigned after an incident. But my flight qualifications were never officially revoked." "What kind of incident?" Blake asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Emma met his eyes directly. "I disobeyed orders to abandon civilians in a combat zone. Flew an unauthorized rescue mission to save 43 Afghan refugees from a Taliban attack. The mission was successful. All civilians were extracted safely. My commanding officer recommended court-martial for insubordination. The operations center digested this information in stunned silence. Dr. Kim spoke first. "So they punished you for saving lives?" "They said I was emotionally compromised and unable to follow military protocol. I was given a choice: face court-martial or accept reassignment to medical support with reduction in rank. I chose medical support because I wanted to keep serving, just in a different way." Private Morgan looked up from his computer. "Captain, those 43 civilians she mentioned?" "I found the after-action report. Taliban forces had surrounded a refugee camp. All other pilots had been ordered to evacuate only military personnel. She flew back alone and extracted entire families under heavy fire. The report calls it tactically unsound but strategically successful." Blake stared at Emma with new understanding. "You gave up your career as a pilot to become a nurse because you wouldn't abandon civilians." "I didn't give up anything," Emma said firmly. "I chose to save lives over following orders. I'd make the same choice today." The radio erupted with urgent chatter from the trap patrol. "Viper Base. This is Alpha 7. We're taking heavy casualties here. Enemy forces are advancing on our position. We need immediate extraction or we're not going to make it." Blake grabbed his radio. "Alpha 7, stand by. We're working on a solution." He turned to Emma, studying her face for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. What he saw was calm determination and the steady gaze of someone who'd faced impossible odds before. "Torres," he said formally, "are you absolutely certain you can conduct this extraction mission?" Emma straightened to attention. "Yes, sir, I can bring them home." Blake took a deep breath, knowing that his next decision would either save 12 lives or end his career. "Then suit up, Lieutenant. You're cleared for takeoff." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Emma Torres, nurse, medic. The quiet woman who fixed things and asked for nothing had just been cleared to fly a military helicopter into active combat. But as she stood in the operations center, surrounded by officers who were still processing the revelation of her true identity, Emma felt the weight of 3 years of careful concealment crashing down around her. "Sir," Lieutenant Cross interjected, his voice tight with concern, "with all due respect, we can't authorize an unauthorized pilot to conduct a combat mission. Even if she has previous experience, she hasn't flown in 3 years. The insurance liability alone." "Cross," Captain Blake cut him off sharply. 12 soldiers are dying. Insurance liability is not my primary concern right now." But Emma could see the doubt creeping into Blake's eyes. The captain was realizing the magnitude of what he'd just authorized. A nurse former pilot or not flying solo into hostile territory to extract a trapped patrol unit. It was the kind of decision that could end careers, trigger investigations, and result in court-martial proceedings for everyone involved. Dr. Kim stepped forward, her face pale with worry. "Emma, you don't have to do this. There has to be another way. Maybe if we contact civilian contractors or..." "Doctor," Emma said quietly, "there's no other way. Those soldiers have maybe 90 minutes of ammunition left. Every minute we spend looking for alternatives is a minute closer to them dying." Private Morgan's radio crackled with another urgent transmission from the trapped patrol. "Viper Base, Alpha 7. Enemy forces are flanking our position. We've got 2 men down with serious injuries. Request immediate medical evacuation." The voice was strained, desperate. In the background, they could hear gunfire and explosions. Emma closed her eyes, and suddenly she was back in Afghanistan, listening to similar transmissions from soldiers who needed someone to risk everything to bring them home. "Captain," she said, opening her eyes with new resolve, "I need to suit up now. Every second we delay increases the danger for those men." But Blake was staring at a form on his desk, an authorization document that would officially sanction Emma's mission. His pen hovered over the signature line as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Torres, I need you to understand what you're asking me to do. If something goes wrong, if you crash, if you're captured or killed, this decision will destroy everyone in this room. Not just our careers, we could all face criminal charges for authorizing an unqualified pilot." "I am qualified, sir," Emma replied firmly. "My flight status was suspended for disciplinary reasons, not competency issues. I've maintained my skills, studied current tactical procedures, and I know that terrain better than most active pilots." Sergeant Foster, who'd been quietly checking equipment manifests, looked up with additional concerns. "Even if you can fly, Torres, you'll be going in alone. No co-pilot, no gunner, no backup support. Standard extraction protocol requires a minimum crew of 3 for hostile territory operations." Emma had already considered this. "I've conducted solo extractions before. Afghanistan 2020. 7 successful missions where crew shortage required single pilot operations. It's not ideal, but it's possible. Afghanistan was 3 years ago," Cross pointed out. "Your reflexes, your tactical awareness, 3 years is a long time to be out of combat flying." "Sir," Emma said, her voice growing stronger, "some skills you don't lose. It's like riding a bicycle, except the bicycle has rotors and the road is full of people shooting at you." Despite the tension, a few officers almost smiled at that. But Blake remained focused on the authorization form. "Torres, I need you to honestly assess your capabilities. Not what you want to be true, not what you hope might work. Can you absolutely, without question, pilot a Blackhawk through enemy fire and successfully extract 12 soldiers?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the question, but the weight of everything that had led to this moment. 3 years of hiding, of pretending to be less than she was, of suppressing instincts that had once made her one of the military's most effective rescue pilots. 3 years of watching helicopters take off and land while she organized medical supplies and checked blood pressure readings. "Sir," she said finally, "I won't lie to you. It's been 3 years since I've flown in combat. I'm probably rusty on some procedures. I'll be going in alone against unknown enemy strength in terrain that offers limited maneuvering room. There are 100 things that could go wrong." Blake's shoulders slumped slightly. "Then maybe we should. But," Emma continued, "I also know that I'm the only chance those soldiers have. I know the Karaba Valley. I've studied every approach route, every potential landing zone, every tactical consideration. I know the capabilities of a UH-60 better than I know my own heartbeat. And I know that if I don't try, 12 good soldiers are going to die while we sit here debating procedure." Dr. Kim watched Emma's face during this speech and saw something she'd never noticed before. Beneath the quiet demeanor and gentle mannerisms was steel, the kind of tempered strength that came from making life and death decisions under impossible pressure. "There's something else," Emma added, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "In Afghanistan, I learned that the worst mistake you can make isn't taking a dangerous risk to save lives. The worst mistake is having the ability to save lives and choosing not to act because it's safer for you personally." The operations center fell silent except for the constant chatter of radio communications and the distant hum of generators. Everyone present understood what Emma was really saying. She'd already been punished once for choosing to save lives over following orders. She was prepared to face those consequences again. Captain Blake looked around the room at his staff. Foster, the experienced sergeant who'd seen enough combat to understand the reality of what they were facing. Morgan, the young communications SPECI-LIST, who was frantically monitoring the deteriorating situation in the valley. Cross, the medical officer who was torn between protocol and the urgent need to save wounded soldiers. Dr. Kim, who'd spent 3 years working alongside Emma, and was only now beginning to understand who she really was. "I need honest opinions," Blake said. "Not what you think I want to hear, not what looks good on paper." "Do we authorize this mission?" Foster spoke first. "Sir, I've seen Torres work under pressure. She doesn't panic, doesn't make mistakes when things get chaotic. If she says she can fly that helicopter, I believe her." Morgan nodded. "The trap patrol is running out of time and options. We can sit here and follow procedure while they die, or we can take a calculated risk to save them." Cross was more hesitant. "The liability issues are enormous. If this goes wrong, we'll all face investigation, but—" He paused, listening to another desperate radio transmission from Alpha 7. "But those are our soldiers out there. We can't just abandon them." Dr. Kim was the last to speak. "I've worked with Emma for 3 years. I've seen her handle medical emergencies that would break most people. She has something that can't be taught, the ability to stay calm and make the right decisions when lives are on the line. If she believes she can do this, then I trust her judgment." Blake looked at Emma one more time. "Torres, if I sign this authorization, there's no turning back. Once you're in that cockpit, you're committed to seeing this through. Are you absolutely certain you're ready for that?" Emma straightened to full attention, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked like the military officer she'd once been. "Sir, I've been ready for 3 years. I just wasn't allowed to show it." Blake picked up his pen, took a deep breath, and signed the authorization form. "Then go bring our boys home, Lieutenant." As Emma turned to leave for the equipment locker, Blake called after her, "Torres." "Yes, sir?" "For what it's worth, I think the military made a mistake 3 years ago. You shouldn't have been grounded for saving lives." Emma smiled, not the polite, careful smile she'd worn as a nurse, but the confident grin of a pilot about to do what she was born to do. "Thank you, sir. But I'm about to prove that some mistakes can be corrected." As she walked toward the hangar, Emma Torres was no longer the quiet nurse who organized medical supplies and fixed broken equipment. She was Lieutenant Emma Torres, combat pilot, about to fly into the most dangerous mission of her career. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again. The equipment locker felt like stepping into a time machine. Emma's hands moved automatically through gear she hadn't touched in 3 years, but that her muscle memory remembered perfectly. Flight suit, tactical vest, combat helmet with integrated communications, survival kit with emergency beacon. Each piece of equipment brought back memories of missions in Afghan mountains, of pilots who'd trusted her with their lives, of soldiers she'd pulled from impossible situations that Dr. Kim had followed her to the locker. Emma, I still can't believe this is happening. 3 years we've worked together, and I had no idea who you really were. Emma checked the fit of her tactical vest, adjusting straps with practiced efficiency. I wasn't lying about being a nurse. Doctor, that part is real. I am both things, pilot and medic. Sometimes life forces you to choose which one to be at any given moment. Why didn't you ever tell me? I would have understood. Emma paused in her equipment check. Because for 3 years, I've been trying to prove that I could be valuable as something other than a pilot, that I could contribute to saving lives without breaking rules or defying orders. But apparently, some situations require you to be exactly who've always been. Chief Mechanic Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, holding a clipboard and looking stunned. Lieutenant Torres? I've got the pre-flight inspection report on Blackhawk 7. She's fueled, armed, and ready for operation. But I have to ask, how long since you've flown a UH-60? 37 months, Emma replied without hesitation. But I've been studying technical manuals, reviewing flight procedures, and mentally rehearsing operations every night for 3 years. Some skills don't fade if you keep them sharp in your mind. Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. Ma'am, I've been maintaining these birds for 15 years. I've seen pilots with current certifications struggle with systems you've been explaining to me for months. How did you know so much about helicopter mechanics while pretending to be just a nurse? Emma secured her sidearm and checked her communication equipment. Because a good pilot understands every system in her aircraft. You can't fly safely if you don't know how things work, how they fail, and how to fix them in an emergency. As they walked toward the hangar, Rodriguez filled her in on the helicopter's specific condition. Blackhawk 7 is our newest bird, fully upgraded avionics, enhanced armor plating, and she's been maintained perfectly. Fuel capacity is sufficient for round trip to Caraba Valley with 30 minutes reserve. Weapon systems are loaded and functional. Emma nodded, absorbing the technical details while her mind shifted into mission planning mode. What's the ammunition load? Standard combat configuration. M240 door guns with 1,200 rounds per side, plus defensive countermeasures for missile threats. The bird is equipped for serious combat, Lieutenant. They reached the hangar where Blackhawk 7 sat ready for departure. Seeing the aircraft triggered something deep in Emma's consciousness, a combination of excitement, nervousness, and profound familiarity. This was her element, her natural environment. For 3 years she'd been a fish trying to live on land. Now she was about to return to the water. Private Morgan jogged up with the latest tactical update. Lieutenant, Alpha 7's last transmission reported enemy forces closing in from 3 directions. They've moved to a defensive position in the Kofung northwest corner of the canyon, but they're running critically low on ammunition. Estimated survival time is 45 minutes. Emma studied the tactical map Morgan handed her, calculating flight time, approach routes, and extraction procedures. Understood. What's the current weather situation? Light crosswinds, visibility. Good, no precipitation. But intelligence reports suggest enemy forces have anti-aircraft capabilities in the area. What kind of anti-aircraft? RPGs confirmed. possibly some small-caliber surface-to-air missiles. Nothing that should threaten a fast-moving helicopter with an experienced pilot. Emma almost smiled at that. Morgan had no idea he'd just given her the exact kind of tactical information she needed to hear. RPGs and small missiles were threats she'd dealt with extensively in Afghanistan. Dangerous but manageable with proper technique and a little luck. Captain Blake arrived as Emma was conducting her pre-flight inspection. Torres, I've been monitoring communications with Regional Command. They're not entirely supportive of this operation. Meaning what, sir? Meaning if this mission succeeds, you'll probably be commended. If it fails, we'll all be court-martialed. No pressure. Emma ran her hands along the helicopter's main rotor assembly, checking for any signs of wear or damage. Sir, I stopped worrying about court-martial the day I chose to save 43 civilians instead of following orders. Some things are more important than military careers. Is that what happened in Afghanistan? You were court-martialed for saving civilians? Emma paused her inspection to look directly at Blake. I was given a choice. Face court-martial for insubordination or accept demotion and reassignment. I chose reassignment because I wanted to keep serving, even if it meant giving up flying. But I never regretted the decision to save those people. Blake studied her face, seeing determination mixed with something that looked like peace. And you don't regret volunteering for this mission? Sir, those 12 soldiers are somebody's sons, fathers, brothers. They volunteered to serve their country, and now they need someone to bring them home. How could I live with myself if I had the ability to save them and chose not to act? Dr. Kim approached with a medical kit specifically configured for combat. Casualties. Emma, I've prepared emergency medical supplies for the extraction. Trauma kits, blood products, pain medication, everything you might need to stabilize wounded soldiers during transport. Emma accepted the medical kit, appreciating both the thoughtfulness and the practical necessity. Thank you, Doctor. In situations like this, being both pilot and medic gives me options other rescue aircraft don't have. Sergeant Foster arrived with the final mission authorization and communication protocols. Lieutenant, you're cleared for immediate departure. Call sign will be Rescue 1. You'll have direct communication with both the trapped patrol and our operations center. Emma climbed into the pilot's seat, and suddenly it was as if she'd never left. Her hands found controls automatically. Her eyes scanned instruments with practiced efficiency, and her mind shifted into the focused state that had made her one of the military's most effective rescue pilots. The engine startup sequence was flawless. Emma's fingers moved through switches and controls with the precision of a pianist playing a familiar concerto. The helicopter's systems came online: one navigation, communication, weapons, defensive systems, everything functioning perfectly. Viper. Base, this is Rescue 1. Emma's voice came through the radio with calm professionalism. Pre-flight complete, all systems nominal, requesting departure clearance. Captain Blake's voice responded. Rescue 1, you are cleared for departure. Bring them home, Lieutenant. Roger, Viper Base. Rescue 1 departing. As the helicopter lifted off, Emma felt 3 years of suppressed identity falling away like chains. The controls responded to her touch as if they'd been waiting for her return. The aircraft rose smoothly into the Syrian desert sky, banking northeast toward the Karaba Valley, where 12 soldiers were counting on a nurse who'd turned out to be something much more. Dr. Kim watched from the ground as the helicopter disappeared into the distance. I still can't believe it, she murmured to Captain Blake. 3 years, and she never said a word. Blake nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Rescue 1 had vanished. Some people hide their strength until the moment it's needed most. I just hope we haven't sent her into a situation she can't handle. But high above the desert, Emma Torres was exactly where she belonged. The quiet nurse was gone, replaced by the combat pilot she'd always been underneath. And for the first time, In 3 years, she wasn't hiding from who she was. She was flying toward it. The Karaba Valley spread below Emma like a jagged wound in the earth. From 2,000 feet, she could see why this terrain was both strategically valuable and tactically nightmare. Steep canyon walls created natural choke points while elevated ridges provided perfect sniper positions. It was the kind of landscape that had been swallowing armies for centuries. "Rescue 1 to Alpha 7, Emma transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm approaching your position from the southwest. What's your current status?" The response came back immediately, strained with exhaustion and stress. "Rescue 1, Alpha 7. We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Enemy forces have us pinned in a depression near grid reference 334,512. We've got 3 wounded. Ammunition critically low. How copy?" Emma checked her navigation display and spotted the grid reference. The patrol had taken cover in a small crater. Created by previous artillery strikes, good for protection from direct fire, but a terrible location for helicopter extraction. The surrounding terrain was littered with rocks and debris that would make landing extremely dangerous. "Alpha 7, I copy your position. Be advised, I'm coming in alone. No gunner support, no backup aircraft. I'll need you to provide covering fire during the extraction." A pause, then a different voice came through the radio. "Rescue 1, this is Sergeant Davis, Alpha 7 leader. Did you say you're coming in alone? Where's your crew?" Emma was already descending toward the valley, studying the tactical situation through her aircraft's targeting systems. Enemy muzzle flashes were visible from at least 6 different positions along the canyon walls. "Alpha 7, crew of 1. Today, but I'm bringing enough firepower to keep things interesting." As she dropped below the rim of the canyon, the situation became immediately clear. The trap patrol was surrounded by insurgent forces positioned in caves and behind rock formations that provided excellent cover. The only way to extract the soldiers would be to land directly in the killing zone while suppressing enemy fire. From multiple directions, Emma's training kicked in automatically. She switched to nap of the earth flying, keeping the helicopter so low that her rotor wash was stirring up dust clouds from the canyon floor. This technique made her harder to target but also more vulnerable to ground fire at close range. "Alpha 7, I'm beginning my approach. Mark your position with green smoke." Green smoke billowed up from the crater where the patrol had taken cover. Emma could see individual soldiers and out-12 men pressed against the walls of their improvised shelter while bullets sparked off the rocks around them. 3 were lying flat, clearly wounded, while the others returned sporadic fire toward the surrounding enemy positions. The first RPG streaked past Emma's cockpit so close she could see the smoke trail. Her reflexes, honed by years of combat flying, kicked in instantly. She threw the helicopter into a sharp banking turn that would have been impossible for most pilots, using the canyon walls to break the line of sight with the rocket launcher. "Taking fire," she reported calmly, beginning attack run. Emma brought the Blackhawk around in a tight circle, using the aircraft's door guns to suppress enemy positions. The M240 machine guns hammered out rounds at 750 per minute, sending streams of tracer fire into cave openings and rock formations where muzzle flashes had been visible. The sound was deafening even inside the armored cockpit. A second RPG exploded against the canyon wall near her tail rotor. Shrapnel peppered the helicopter's armored plating, but the critical systems remained undamaged. Emma adjusted her approach angle, using the terrain to mask her movements while continuing to lay down. Suppressing fire. "Alpha 7, I'm coming in hot. Be ready to move on my signal." She lined up for the landing approach but immediately saw the problem. The crater where the patrol had taken shelter was too small for a safe landing. Rocks and debris would damage her rotor blades, and the uneven ground could cause the aircraft to tip over. She would have to hover while the soldiers climbed aboard, a procedure that would leave both the helicopter and the patrol exposed to enemy fire for several critical minutes. Alpha 7, the landing zone is too rough for touchdown. I'll hover. At 3 feet, load your wounded first, then everyone else. Move fast. Emma brought the Blackhawk into a precision hover just above the patrol's position. The rotor wash created a massive dust cloud that provided some concealment, but also made it difficult to see threats. She had to rely on instrument flying while maintaining perfect position control in turbulent air currents created by the canyon walls. Enemy fire intensified as soon as the helicopter stopped moving. Bullets sparked off the armored cockpit, and Emma could hear the distinctive crack of rifle rounds passing close to her head. She activated the helicopter's defensive systems, deploying chaff and flares to confuse any heat-seeking missiles that might be targeting her. "Loading wounded now," came the shout from below. Emma could see soldiers carrying their injured comrades toward the helicopter's side doors. The process seemed to take forever, each second stretching into eternity as more enemy fire concentrated on their position. A heavy machine gun opened up from a ridge position Emma hadn't spotted earlier. The larger caliber rounds were punching through her armor plating in places, and warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure was dropping, and she could feel the controls becoming less responsive. Alpha 7, how many more to load? 6 more, plus equipment. Emma made a split-second decision. Leave the equipment. Personnel only. We need to move now. She could see tracers streaming toward the helicopter from multiple directions. One of the door gunner's positions had been hit, the weapon hanging useless from its mount. The aircraft was taking damage faster than it could sustain, but the soldiers were still loading. A mortar round exploded 20 meters away, showering the helicopter with rocks and debris. Emma felt the aircraft shudder as shrapnel damaged the tail rotor assembly. The pedal controls became mushy, making it much harder to maintain stable hover. All personnel aboard. Sergeant Davis shouted through the radio. Emma didn't wait for confirmation. She pulled collective and cyclic simultaneously, lifting the overloaded helicopter out of the crater in a steep climbing turn that pushed the aircraft to its performance limits. The engine temperature spiked into the red zone as she demanded maximum power from systems that were already damaged. More RPGs streaked past as she climbed toward the canyon rim. One exploded close enough to crack her cockpit glass, but the helicopter kept flying. Emma's hands moved constantly across the controls, compensating for damaged systems and maintaining control despite multiple equipment failures. "Rescue 1 to Viper Base," she transmitted as they cleared the canyon walls. "Package secure. 12 souls on board. 3 urgent medical. Aircraft damaged but flyable. Eta to base 15 minutes. Captain Blake's voice came back immediately. "Rescue 1, outstanding work. Medical team standing by." But Emma was already focused on the flight home. The helicopter was flying, but barely. Hydraulic fluid was leaking from damaged lines. The tail rotor was vibrating ominously, and the engine was running dangerously hot. She had 15 minutes to cover 60 kilometers in an aircraft that might fall apart at any moment. Behind her, the soldiers she'd just rescued were treating their wounded comrades and staring at their pilot with something approaching awe. They'd watched a single helicopter fly into impossible odds and extract them from certain death. They'd seen precision flying that bordered on supernatural, combat skills that seemed to defy physics. As the helicopter limped toward forward operating base Viper, Emma Torres was no longer just a nurse who could fly. She was a combat pilot who'd just completed one of the most daring rescue missions in military history. And she wasn't done yet. She still had to get everyone home alive. The damaged Blackhawk touched down at forward operating base Viper. with smoke trailing from its engine compartment and hydraulic fluid dripping from multiple punctures in the fuselage. Emma Torres shut down the aircraft with the same methodical precision she'd used to start it, but her hands were trembling slightly as she completed the post-flight checklist. Adrenaline was finally catching up with her. Medical personnel swarmed the helicopter before the rotors had fully stopped spinning. Dr. Kim led the trauma team, efficiently triaging the 3 wounded soldiers while the remaining patrol members climbed out on their own. Emma remained in the pilot's seat for a moment, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. She'd done it. 12 soldiers were alive because she'd chosen to act instead of waiting for authorization that might never have come. But as she watched the medical team work, Emma knew that the hardest part might still be ahead of her. Captain Blake approached the aircraft, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. "Torres, are you injured?" Emma removed her helmet and climbed down from the cockpit. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat, and she could see blood on her hands from where shrapnel had cut through her gloves. "No, sir, just minor cuts." All 12 personnel extracted successfully, 3 wounded but stable. Blake studied her face, still trying to reconcile the quiet nurse he'd known for 3 years with the combat pilot who'd just performed a miracle. "Torres, what you just did. I've never seen flying like that. Where did you learn to pilot like that?" Before Emma could answer, Sergeant Davis from the rescued patrol approached them. His uniform was torn and bloody, but his eyes were bright with gratitude and something approaching reverence. "Sir," he said to Blake, "I need to report that Lieutenant Torres just performed the most extraordinary rescue operation I've ever witnessed. She flew into a kill zone that had us completely surrounded and extracted our entire unit under heavy fire." Blake nodded, but his attention was focused on Emma. "Torres, we need to debrief this mission, and we need to understand how a nurse became qualified to conduct combat helicopter operations." Emma straightened to attention. "Yes, sir, I'm ready. For whatever investigation is necessary." "It's not about investigation," Blake said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's about understanding what just happened and how to properly document it." Within an hour, the base was buzzing with news of the impossible rescue. Word spread quickly through military channels. A nurse at Forward Operating Base Viper had somehow piloted a helicopter into heavy combat and extracted a trapped patrol. The story was so unusual that it immediately attracted attention from higher command levels. Private Morgan burst into the operations center where Blake was attempting to write his after-action report. "Captain, I've got regional command on the line. They want immediate clarification about today's unauthorized flight operation." Blake picked up the radio with obvious reluctance. "Viper Base to Regional Command." "Viper Base, this is Colonel Reed. I understand you authorized a nurse to conduct a combat rescue mission. Please explain how this was possible." Blake chose his words carefully. "Sir, Lieutenant Torres revealed that she has extensive helicopter pilot training and volunteered to conduct the extraction when no other pilots were available." "Lieutenant Torres? Your personnel files show Emma Torres as enlisted medical staff, not an officer. And definitely not a pilot." "Sir, it appears there are classified sections of her personnel file that we didn't have access to. She was, in fact, a certified military helicopter pilot before her assignment to medical duties." A long pause filled the radio channel. "Viper Base, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into this incident. All personnel involved are restricted to base pending review. And I want Lieutenant Torres' complete service record, every document, every classification level." Blake looked across the room at Emma, who was quietly organizing medical supplies. As if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Understood, sir. All personnel will remain available for investigation." After the radio call ended, Blake found Emma in the medical bay, checking on the soldiers she'd rescued. The 3 wounded men were stable, and the others were recounting their rescue to anyone who would listen. "Torres," Blake said quietly, Regional Command is sending an investigation team. They want your complete service record, including all classified sections. Emma nodded without looking up from her patient charts. I expected as much, sir. I'm ready to face whatever consequences come from today's actions. Dr. Kim, who'd been listening from nearby, stepped closer. Emma, you saved 12 lives today. Surely that counts for something. It does, doctor. But military protocol exists. For reasons, and I violated several procedures today. The fact that the mission was successful doesn't automatically justify the methods. Sergeant Foster entered the medical bay with a handful of documents. Torres, I've been reviewing your maintenance logs from the past 3 years. Every helicopter issue you've identified, every repair suggestion you've made, every technical modification you've recommended, they were all correct. How does a nurse know more about helicopter maintenance than certified mechanics? Emma finally looked up from her charts. Because I spent 4 years learning those systems before I ever became a nurse, Sergeant. Being reassigned to medical duties didn't erase my technical knowledge. Foster shook his head in amazement. Ma'am, some of the procedures you suggested were advanced techniques that aren't even in standard manuals. Where did you learn them? Advanced Combat Aviation School, specialized rescue operations training, and 36 months of combat deployment in Afghanistan. Emma replied simply. The medical bay went quiet. Even the wounded soldiers stopped their conversations to listen. Emma had just revealed more about her background in 30 seconds than she had in 3 years of serving alongside these people. Dr. Kim sat down across from Emma, her expression thoughtful. Afghanistan, how many rescue missions did you fly? Emma hesitated, then seemed to decide that secrecy was no longer possible. 87 confirmed rescues. 243 personnel extracted from hostile territory. 15 missions. Flown in conditions that other pilots deemed impossible. Jesus, whispered one of the rescued soldiers. No wonder you knew exactly what to do out there. Blake studied Emma's face, seeing her completely differently now. Torres, if you had that kind of experience, that level of skill, why were you reassigned to medical duties? Why give up flying? Emma was quiet for a long moment, organizing her thoughts carefully. Because 3 years ago, I was ordered to abandon a civilian rescue operation. My commanding officer said the risk to military personnel was too high, that civilian casualties were acceptable losses. I disagreed. So you disobeyed orders, Blake said, understanding beginning to dawn. I completed the rescue mission. 43 Afghan civilians, including 15 children, extracted from a Taliban ambush. 0 military casualties, 0 civilian casualties, mission 100% successful. Foster looked confused. That sounds like exemplary performance. Why would you be punished for a successful rescue? Emma's voice carried a note of old bitterness. Because I embarrassed a general who had already written those people off as dead. Because I proved that his impossible assessment was wrong. Because I prioritized human lives over political considerations. Dr. Kim was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened 3 years ago. So they destroyed your flying career to cover up their mistake. They offered me a choice: face court-martial for insubordination or accept demotion and reassignment to non-flying duties. I chose to keep serving, even if it meant giving up what I loved most. The room digested this information in stunned silence. Emma Torres hadn't just been a good pilot who'd made a mistake. She'd been an exceptional pilot who'd been punished for being too good, too committed to saving lives, too willing to take risks that others wouldn't. Blake realized he was looking at someone whose career had been destroyed not by incompetence or cowardice, but by an excess of courage and conscience. Torres, when the investigation team arrives, they're going to want to know everything about your background. Are you prepared for that? Emma nodded. Sir, I've been hiding for 3 years. I'm tired of pretending to be less than I am. If today's Mission means my true service record becomes public, then so be it. Outside, they could hear helicopters approaching, the investigation team arriving ahead of schedule. Emma's past was about to catch up with her present, and everyone at Forward Operating Base, Viper, was about to learn exactly who they'd been working alongside for 3 years. The quiet nurse was gone forever. What remained was Lieutenant Emma Torres, combat pilot, whose story was far from over. Colonel Reed arrived at Forward Operating Base Viper with a team of investigators and a briefcase full of classified documents that would change everything. He was a tall, stern man with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions, and his first order of business was a private meeting with the nurse who'd somehow become the most talked-about pilot in the Syrian theater of operations. Emma sat across from Colonel Reed in Captain Blake's office, her posture military straight. Despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes, the adrenaline from the rescue mission had worn off, leaving behind the bone-deep fatigue that came from flying in combat conditions. But her gaze remained steady as Reed opened her complete service file. "Lieutenant Torres," Reed began, emphasizing her former rank, "I've reviewed your personnel records. All of them, including the sections that have been classified for the past 3 years. What I've found is remarkable." Emma remained silent, waiting for whatever judgment was coming. Reed pulled out a photograph and placed it on the desk between them. It showed Emma in flight gear, standing next to a Blackhawk helicopter with her squadron mates. She looked younger, more confident, wearing the expression of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Advanced Combat Aviation School, class of 2019. Graduated first in a class of 47 students. Instructor evaluations describe you as the most naturally gifted pilot we've ever trained, and someone who flies like she was born in a cockpit. Reed looked up from the file. Your flight instructors recommended you for every elite program the military offers. Emma nodded slightly. Yes, sir. I was very fortunate to receive excellent training. Reed continued reading. Afghanistan deployment, 2019 to 2021, 87. Successful rescue missions, as you mentioned. But the details are extraordinary. You flew missions that other pilots refused to attempt. Night operations in zero visibility. Extractions from landing zones that were deemed impossible. Rescues. Conducted under heavy enemy fire. He pulled out another document. Operation Guardian Angel, November 2020. You flew solo into a Taliban stronghold to extract a downed pilot. Intelligence said it was a suicide mission. You brought him home without a scratch. He had a wife and 2 daughters back home, Emma said quietly. That seemed more important than following safe procedures. Operation Shepherd's Watch, February 2021. You conducted 17 separate rescue flights in a 48-hour period during a major Taliban offensive. 212 personnel extracted, including 60 wounded soldiers. You flew for 2 straight days with minimal rest. Emma's jaw tightened slightly. People needed help. That's what we were there for. Reed set down the documents and studied her face. Torres, your record in Afghanistan reads like something out of a movie. You were nominated for the Distinguished Flying Cross twice, recommended for promotion to captain, and personally commended by 3 different commanding officers. So what happened? The question hung in the air like smoke. Emma was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. I was ordered to abandon a civilian rescue operation. My commanding officer, General Morrison, said the risk to military personnel was unacceptable and that civilian casualties were an inevitable cost of war. But you disagreed. 43 people, including 15 children, were trapped in a school that had been hit by artillery fire. Taliban forces were advancing on their position. General Morrison said we couldn't risk military assets to save non-essential personnel. Reed consulted his notes. But you flew the mission anyway. Emma's voice grew stronger. I flew the mission Because those children deserved the same chance at survival as any soldier. Because leaving people to die when you have the ability to save them isn't military strategy, it's moral cowardice. The mission was successful. All 43 civilians extracted safely, 0 military casualties. Yet you were disciplined. Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. General Morrison had already told the media that the civilians were lost. That rescue was impossible. When I proved him wrong, I made him look like either a coward or a liar. Neither option was acceptable to his career prospects. Reed leaned back in his chair. So he destroyed yours instead. He offered me a choice: face court-martial for insubordination or accept demotion and reassignment to non-flying duties. He made it clear that if I chose court-martial, he would ensure I was convicted and dishonorably discharged. Why didn't you fight it? With your record, with the successful mission results, you could have challenged his authority. Emma was quiet for a moment, remembering the weight of that decision. Because 43 people were alive, because I disobeyed orders. Fighting the court-martial would have meant months or years of legal proceedings, during which other soldiers might die while I was tied up in bureaucratic battles. I chose to accept demotion and keep serving in whatever capacity I could. Reed pulled out another document. According to these records, General Morrison recommended you for medical corps training, describing you as better suited for support roles than combat operations. He made it sound like you'd requested the transfer. I never requested anything. I was told to report to medical training or face immediate discharge. So I learned to be a nurse because healing people seemed like the closest thing to my original mission that I was allowed to do. Colonel Reed closed the file and looked directly at Emma. Torres, I need you to understand something. General Morrison is no longer in command. He was quietly reassigned to a desk job last year after multiple investigations into his decision-making. During the Afghan withdrawal, several of his orders have been posthumously overturned. Emma's eyes widened slightly. Sir, which means your disciplinary action is being reviewed as part of a broader investigation into Morrison's command decisions. But more immediately, your actions today have caught the attention of some very senior officers who are asking why one of our most skilled pilots has been organizing medical supplies for 3 years. Emma felt something shifting inside her chest. Hope. Maybe, or just the possibility of hope. What does that mean, sir? Reed opened his briefcase and pulled out a new set of documents. It means you have some choices to make, Lieutenant. And this time, they're your choices, not punishments disguised as options. He placed the first document on the desk. Full reinstatement to flight status with promotion to captain. Assignment to the elite rescue squadron based in Germany. Full restoration of your flying credentials and back pay for the 3 years you've been improperly assigned. Emma stared at the document, hardly believing what she was reading. Option 2, Reed continued, placing a second document down. Transfer to the military's new Humanitarian Operations Division. You'd lead a specialized unit that conducts rescue operations in civilian disaster zones. Essentially, you'd be doing exactly what got you in trouble 3 years ago, but with full authorization and support. And option 3? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew. You can remain in medical corps if you prefer. Your performance as a nurse has been exemplary, and Dr. Kim has specifically requested that you be allowed to stay if that's your choice. You've proven you can serve with distinction in any capacity. Emma looked at the documents, then back at Colonel Reed. Sir, may I ask what prompted this review of my case? Reed smiled for the first time since arriving. 12 soldiers you rescued today all submitted individual statements describing your actions. Sergeant Davis wrote a 3-page report calling today's mission the most skillful flying I've ever witnessed. Captain Blake submitted a recommendation that you be immediately reinstated and promoted. And Dr. Kim wrote a letter stating that punishing someone for saving lives is the kind of bureaucratic stupidity that makes good people leave the military. Emma felt her throat tighten with emotion. They didn't have to do that. Yes, they did. Because they recognized something that General Morrison failed to see. You're exactly the kind of person the military needs more of, not fewer of. Reed leaned forward. Torres, what you did 3 years ago wasn't insubordination. It was leadership. And what you did today proves that 3 years of punishment didn't break your spirit or diminish your skills. Emma studied the documents again, feeling the weight of possibility after years of resignation. For the first time in 3 years, she could choose who she wanted to be instead of accepting who others had decided she should be. The investigation had revealed more than just her hidden past. It had revealed that sometimes the system could recognize its mistakes and try to correct them. Sometimes doing the right thing didn't have to end your career, it could restart it. Word of Emma's vindication spread through forward operating base Viper faster than a sandstorm across the desert. By evening, the entire base knew that their quiet nurse was not only a decorated combat pilot, but had been wrongfully punished for saving civilian lives. The revelation changed everything about how people saw her, how they understood the past 3 years, and how they viewed the events of that day. Dr. Kim found Emma in the medical bay later that evening, reviewing the treatment records for the soldiers she'd rescued. Emma, I owe you an apology. Emma looked up from her charts, adjusting her glasses in the familiar gesture that had characterized her for 3 years. Doctor, you have nothing to apologize for. You treated me with kindness and respect from the day I arrived here. But I treated you like you needed protection, like you were fragile. I assigned you to easier duties, lighter responsibilities, because I thought you couldn't handle the pressure. Dr. Kim sat down across from her. I had no idea I was working with someone who'd flown 87 combat rescue missions. Emma smiled, not the careful, polite smile she'd worn as a nurse, but something more genuine. Doctor, you gave me exactly what I needed for 3 years. A chance to heal people, to serve in a meaningful way, to rebuild my sense of purpose after having it torn away. You helped me remember why I wanted to save lives in the first place. But didn't you feel frustrated? Wasted? You were organizing medical supplies when you could have been flying rescue missions. Emma considered this carefully. At first, yes. I was angry and bitter about what had happened. But working with you, learning to be a nurse, treating wounded soldiers, it taught me that there are many ways to save lives. Flying rescue missions was what I was trained for, but caring for patients, preventing infections, monitoring recovery, that saves lives too. Dr. Kim looked at the documents Colonel Reed had left on the desk. Have you decided which option you're going to choose? Emma hadn't touched the papers since Reed left them with her. I'm still thinking. 3 years ago, I would have grabbed the flight status reinstatement without hesitation. But now ... She paused, organizing her thoughts. Now I understand that sometimes the most important missions aren't the ones that get you medals or recognition. Sergeant Foster knocked on the van door frame. Torres? Sorry to interrupt, but Sergeant Davis from the rescued patrol wants to speak with you. Emma nodded, and Davis entered with his arm in a sling but his expression determined. Lieutenant Torres, I wanted to thank you personally for what you did today. But more than that, I wanted to tell you something. He pulled a letter from his pocket, handwritten on official stationery. My entire squad has submitted a formal request to higher command. We want you designated as our primary medical evacuation pilot. We've all agreed that if we're ever in trouble again, you're the only person we want coming to get us. Emma felt her throat tighten with emotion. Sergeant, I appreciate that, but, ma'am, with respect, let me finish. We've also learned about what happened to you 3 years ago, about how you were punished for saving civilian lives. And we want you to know that every soldier in that valley today is alive because you made the right choice then and again today. Davis handed her the letter, We know you have decisions to make about your future. But we hope you'll remember that there are soldiers out here who need someone like you. Someone who won't abandon us when the mission gets difficult." After Davis left, Emma sat alone in the medical bay, staring at the letter and the three options Colonel Reed had presented. Each choice represented a different path, a different version of who she could become. Captain Blake appeared in the doorway. "Torres, sorry to bother you, but I wanted to give you an update. Regional Command has completed their preliminary review of today's mission." Emma straightened, preparing for whatever judgment was coming. "Yes, sir. You're being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in aerial combat. The official citation reads, for heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. Lieutenant Torres distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous actions while conducting a solo rescue mission under intense enemy fire. Her expert flying and disregard for personal safety resulted in the successful extraction of 12 personnel from hostile territory." Emma stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "Sir, I was flying without authorization. Technically, I was in violation of multiple regulations." Blake smiled. "Torres, sometimes regulations exist to prevent bad decisions, but sometimes they also prevent necessary ones. Higher command has determined that your actions were not only justified, but exemplary. You're not being punished, you're being recognized for doing exactly what a military pilot should do." He paused, then added, "There's something else. General Morrison's entire Afghan command is being reviewed. Several other pilots have come forward with stories similar to yours, missions they were ordered not to fly, rescues they were told not to attempt. It appears that what happened to you was part of a pattern of command failures." Emma felt a weight she'd carried for 3 years beginning to lift. "Does that mean other people were wrongfully punished?" "It means the truth is finally coming out. And it means that what you did 3 years ago, refusing to abandon those civilians, is being recognized as an act of courage, not insubordination." That evening, Emma walked to the flight line where the damaged Blackhawk sat being repaired by Chief Mechanic Rodriguez and his crew. The helicopter bore the scars of combat bullet holes, shrapnel damage, hydraulic stains on the concrete below. But it had brought everyone home. Rodriguez looked up from his work. "Lieutenant Torres, she'd be ready to fly again in 48 hours. Armor plating held up well, engine still good, just need to replace some hydraulic lines and patch the bullet holes." Emma ran her hand along the fuselage, remembering the feeling of flying in combat again, of using her skills for their intended purpose. "Thank you, Chief. She performed perfectly today." "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what are you going to decide? About your future, I mean." Emma looked up at the stars appearing in the Syrian sky. "I'm going to choose the option that lets me save the most lives, whether that's as a pilot, a nurse, or something else entirely." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That sounds like exactly what Lieutenant Torres would say." As Emma walked back toward her quarters, she passed the medical bay where Dr. Kim was working the night shift. Through the window, she could see the rescued soldiers recovering from their ordeal, receiving the care they needed to heal completely. She thought about the 43 Afghan civilians she'd saved 3 years ago, about the 12 soldiers she'd rescued today, about all the patients she'd treated as a nurse. Each life saved mattered. Each person brought home safely was someone's son, daughter, spouse, parent. The method of saving them, whether through flying, nursing, or any other form of service, was less important than the commitment to keep trying. For the first time in 3 years, Emma Torres knew exactly who she was, someone who would always choose to save lives, regardless of the personal cost. The military had finally figured out that this wasn't a flaw to be punished. It was exactly the kind of person they needed more of. Tomorrow, she would make her decision about which path to take. But tonight, she was content knowing that 12 soldiers were alive, Her name had been cleared, and she would never again have to hide who she really was. 6 months later, Captain Emma Torres stood in the briefing room of the newly established Humanitarian Operations Division at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The walls were lined with photos of successful rescue missions, earthquake victims pulled from rubble, flood survivors evacuated from rooftops, civilians extracted from war zones. It was exactly the kind of work she'd been born to do, and now she had full authorization and support to do it. "Your next mission," said Colonel Mitchell, the division commander, "is a medical evacuation from a refugee camp in Jordan. Severe sandstorm has isolated the camp, and they have critical patients who need immediate hospital care. Weather conditions are marginal, but it's within acceptable parameters for someone with your experience." Emma studied the mission briefing, automatically calculating flight times, fuel requirements, and landing zone challenges. "Sir, these conditions aren't marginal, they're severe. Visibility near zero, crosswinds up to 50 knots, and the landing zone is unprepared terrain surrounded by temporary structures." Colonel Mitchell looked at her with slight concern. "Are you saying the mission isn't feasible?" Emma smiled, the confident smile of someone who'd found her perfect place in the world. "Sir, I'm saying it's exactly the kind of mission this division was created for. When do we launch? 30 minutes. Your crew is already prepping the aircraft." As Emma gathered her flight gear, she reflected on the decision she'd made 6 months ago. When Colonel Reed had offered her 3 choices, she'd surprised everyone, including herself, by asking for a 4th option: the chance to create something new. The Humanitarian Operations Division was her compromise between flying and healing, between military service and civilian rescue, between following orders and following her conscience. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Kim, back at Forward Operating Base Viper. "Saw the news about your Jordan mission on CNN. The reporter called you the military's most decorated rescue pilot. Thought you should know that 3 new nurses have requested assignment here because they heard about your work. You're inspiring people even when you're thousands of miles away." Emma smiled at the message. One of the unexpected consequences of her story becoming public was that it had encouraged other people to pursue careers in military medicine and rescue operations. Young pilots were volunteering for humanitarian missions. Experienced nurses were cross-training in aviation support, and the entire concept of what it meant to serve was evolving. Chief Warrant Officer Jackson, her co-pilot for today's mission, approached with the pre-flight checklist. "Captain Torres, aircraft is fueled and ready. Medical equipment loaded per your specifications. Weather's getting worse, but the bird can handle it if we launch now." Emma had requested Jackson specifically because of his experience with civilian rescue operations. Unlike combat missions, humanitarian evacuations required different skills: patience with frightened civilians, medical knowledge for treating refugees, and the ability to work with international relief organizations. "What's the passenger manifest?" Emma asked, reviewing the flight plan. 12 patients, ranging from severe dehydration to complications from diabetes. 2 pregnant women, 1 elderly man with heart conditions, and several children under 5 years old, plus medical personnel to provide care during transport. Emma nodded, automatically shifting into the focused mindset that had characterized her flying for 8 years. But now there was something different. She wasn't fighting against regulations or hiding her capabilities. She was using every skill she'd developed, with full support and authorization, to save lives in the most direct way possible. The flight to Jordan took 2 hours through increasingly difficult weather conditions. Emma navigated through sandstorms and turbulence that would have grounded less experienced pilots, using techniques she'd learned in Afghanistan, combined with new procedures developed specifically for humanitarian missions. "Jordan Control, this is Rescue 7, Emma transmitted as they approached the refugee camp. "Requesting permission to land at the emergency landing zone." Rescue 7. Weather conditions are below minimums for normal operations. Are you sure you can attempt landing? Emma could see the camp through breaks in the sandstorm, thousands of temporary shelters, people moving between them despite the dangerous conditions, and a small cleared area where desperate refugees had marked a landing zone with whatever materials they could find. Jordan Control, I can see the landing zone. People need medical care that can't wait for better weather. Requesting clearance to attempt approach. Rescue 7, cleared to land at your discretion. Medical team standing by. The landing was challenging but successful. Emma brought the helicopter down in swirling sand and near-zero visibility, using instrument flying combined with visual references from the refugees who guided her with flashlights and makeshift signals. As soon as they touched down, medical personnel began loading patients while Emma kept the engines running to prevent sand infiltration. One of the refugee camp doctors approached her cockpit. Captain, thank you for coming in these conditions. We have patients who would not have survived another day without evacuation. Emma nodded, checking her instruments while patients were loaded. Doctor, this is what we're here for. When people need help, we don't wait for perfect conditions. The flight back to the hospital was smooth despite the weather. Emma monitored the medical team's work through her headset, occasionally adjusting flight parameters to provide the smoothest possible ride for critically ill patients. By the time they landed at the receiving hospital, all 12 patients were stable and ready for advanced treatment. After shutdown, Emma was approached by a news crew that had been following humanitarian operations in the region. Captain Torres, this is your 15th rescue mission this year. What drives you to take these risks to help people you've never met? Emma removed her helmet and considered the question. 6 months ago, she would have deflected or given a standard military response. But her story was public now, and she'd learned that honesty could inspire others to serve. 3 years ago, I was punished for believing that every life has value, regardless of nationality, politics, or military utility. Today, I have a job that exists specifically because that belief is now official policy. When people need help, you help them. It's not more complicated than that. Some critics say that military resources shouldn't be used for civilian rescue operations. How do you respond to that? Emma thought about the 43 Afghan civilians she'd saved, the 12 soldiers from Karaba Valley, and the refugees she'd evacuated today. Military resources exist to protect people. Sometimes that means combat operations. Sometimes it means humanitarian missions. But the goal is always the same: bringing people home safely. That evening, Emma received a video call from the soldiers she'd rescued in Syria. Sergeant Davis had organized a reunion, and all 12 were healthy, recovered, and back with their families. Captain Torres, Davis said, we wanted you to know that our kids are calling you Aunt Emma now. They know that someone special brought their dads home. Emma felt the familiar tightening in her throat that came whenever she was reminded of why she'd chosen this life. Sergeant, I hope they grow up in a world where fewer people need rescuing. But if they don't, I hope they become the kind of people who do the rescuing. After the call ended, Emma walked to her apartment window, looking out at the German countryside. Somewhere in Jordan, 12 refugees were receiving medical care because she'd flown through a sandstorm. Somewhere in Syria, 12 soldiers were alive because she'd refused to stay hidden. Somewhere in Afghanistan, 43 civilians were building new lives because she'd disobeyed orders 3 years ago. The world was full of quiet, people doing extraordinary things, teachers who inspired, mechanics who innovated, nurses who healed, pilots who rescued. They didn't wait for permission to be heroic. They just waited for the moment when someone needed saving. Emma Torres had spent 3 years hiding who she was, pretending to be less capable than her true self. Now she was exactly where she belonged, not in the shadows, but flying toward whatever storm needed to be faced. Because sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones nobody notices until the crisis hits, and they're the only ones willing to fly directly into it. The story of the nurse who flew a Blackhawk through enemy fire had become legend. But for Emma, it was just Tuesday. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that some people don't need permission to save lives. They just need the chance. And Emma Torres would always be ready to take that chance. No matter how dangerous the storm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.